Most Canadians will scroll past this headline without a second thought. The Bank of Canada joins something called Project Agorá to test improvements in wholesale cross-border payments. It sounds technical, maybe even boring. But underneath that language is one of the most consequential experiments in modern monetary infrastructure, and it could quietly reshape how every dollar you earn, spend, or borrow moves through the global system. Before we get into what this project means, we need to understand what wholesale cross-border payments are, because this is not about tapping your phone at a coffee shop. Wholesale payments are the enormous flows of money that move between banks, institutions, and governments across countries. When a Canadian bank settles a trade with a European counterparty, or when foreign currency reserves are rebalanced, that is the wholesale layer. It is the plumbing of the global financial system, mostly invisible to ordinary Canadians, but absolutely foundational to everything they do experience. The Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, is often called the central bank of central banks. It is based in Basel, Switzerland, and its membership includes the most powerful monetary authorities on the planet. When the BIS launches a project and invites central banks to participate, it is not a fringe experiment. It is the establishment stress testing its own future. Project Agorá specifically is focused on whether tokenization, the process of representing real financial assets and currencies as digital tokens on a programmable ledger, can make wholesale cross-border payments faster, cheaper, and more transparent. Tokenization is a word that gets misused constantly, so let us be precise. In this context, it means taking a real-world asset, like a Canadian dollar held at the Bank of Canada, and representing it as a programmable digital token that can move, settle, and interact with other tokens automatically and near instantly. The current system of cross-border wholesale payments relies on correspondent banking networks, which can involve multiple intermediaries, multiple time zones, and settlement delays that span days. Tokenization, in theory, allows two parties in different countries to exchange value the way you might send an email, directly, instantly, and with a programmable record of the transaction. The fact that the Bank of Canada is joining this initiative now is meaningful context on its own. Central banks globally have spent the better part of a decade watching private actors, from cryptocurrency networks to stablecoin issuers, attempt to solve cross-border payment inefficiencies from the outside. The entry of multiple central banks into a coordinated BIS-led test suggests that the official monetary system is no longer content to observe from a distance. The timing lines up with growing pressure on traditional correspondent banking, rising geopolitical fragmentation of payment systems, and a broader race among major economies to define the infrastructure standards of the next financial era. Canada is a deeply trade-dependent economy. Exports and imports represent an enormous share of economic activity, which means the efficiency of cross-border financial infrastructure is not an abstract concern, it has a direct bearing on the cost of doing business across borders. When wholesale payment systems are slow or expensive, those costs eventually travel downstream. They show up in the margins of businesses that import goods, in the rates that Canadian companies pay to access foreign capital, and ultimately in the prices that ordinary Canadians pay for everything from electronics to food. The connection between wholesale payment infrastructure and a household mortgage or grocery bill is indirect, but it is real. More efficient cross-border settlement reduces friction for Canadian financial institutions operating internationally, which over time can affect funding costs. It can also affect the speed and cost of remittances, money that Canadians with family abroad send internationally, a flow that today often loses a meaningful percentage to fees and exchange rate spreads. If Project Agorá produces a workable model, the downstream effect on everyday financial transactions, though years away, could be material. Honest analysis requires acknowledging what we do not know. Tokenized wholesale payments introduce questions about cybersecurity at the highest levels of the financial system, about how monetary sovereignty is maintained when multiple central bank tokens interact on a shared ledger, and about what happens to the existing correspondent banking infrastructure and the institutions that depend on it. The Bank of Canada joining a test is not a commitment to implementation, it is research. But the direction of that research tells us where policymakers believe the system needs to go, and that alone is worth watching closely. Step back further and you see a pattern. Major economies are quietly competing to shape the architecture of future money movement. The choices made in experimental phases like Project Agorá, which ledger standards are adopted, which currencies anchor the system, which institutions play the central role, will have consequences that compound over decades. Canada's participation ensures it has a seat at that table rather than inheriting rules written by others. That is a strategic consideration as much as a technical one. Here is what to monitor as this develops. Watch for any BIS publication of Project Agorá findings, which will give the clearest picture of whether tokenized wholesale settlement is technically viable at scale. Watch for the Bank of Canada's own communications on payment system modernization, including updates to its work on a potential digital Canadian dollar. And watch for whether other major central banks, particularly the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, deepen their own involvement, because the value of this infrastructure depends entirely on how many major currencies are willing to participate. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribing keeps this kind of analysis coming. No hype, just the numbers and what they actually mean.